Alright, so in the last part, the first part of this lecture, we left off with levels of organization associated with living organisms, starting at the atom, working all the way up to the ecosystem level. And we want to be able to look at the interactions between organisms at population levels, at community levels, and then also ecosystem levels. As ecosystem changes, how does that influence changes on the individual populations, the organisms, etc.? A significant challenge for marine biology is that it's a massive ecosystem. It covers 2/3 of the Earth, and we still know relatively little about the entire ecosystem of the ocean. We've been to the moon more times than we've been to the bottom of the ocean. We have more knowledge of the surface of the moon than what we do with some parts of the ocean floor. We're learning more. Every year, more knowledge is gained, but it's still a vast undertaking and one in which our knowledge has a long way to go. So it provides some great opportunities, and it can be very exciting to be part of that field of science, to explore something that is somewhat unknown. So great opportunities there. All right, so as we look at life in the sea, one of the biggest challenges all life in the sea faces is salt water, the salinity of the ocean. Salt concentration of the ocean is about 3.5%. So what this means is every organism living in the ocean has to be able to manage life in that salt environment, that concentration or salinity. So what this brings up are two fundamental principles to all life, but especially important to life in the oceans, the principles of diffusion and osmosis. So hopefully these look familiar. Diffusion, movement of solutes or molecules or particles from a high to a low concentrated area. They're constantly moving around, random molecular motion, but moving high to low concentration. Osmosis is going to be the movement of water through a membrane. So this is when water is going into the cell or out of the cell of living organisms. Now, this is an incredibly important factor for things to be able to regulate osmosis. Too much water comes in, you swell up. Too much water leaves, you shrivel up. That can be life-threatening. And you think about if you're living near the shore, say your grasses living in the shallow parts of the beach, it's only 3-4 inches of water, and you get a heavy rain. 2 inches of rain, all that water runs off the coast, off the shoreline, into the ocean. Instantly, your salinity changes because of that influx of fresh water. Well, you now have to be able to regulate the water concentration and the movement of water through your cells so you don't swell up and explode, or so you don't shrivel up and die. So osmosis is a very, very critical thing for organisms to be able to regulate if they're going to survive in the ocean or in the seas. So when we look at sea life, a lot of them are what we call osmoregulators. This means they control the internal concentrations of solutes and water within their body. So the fish on the left is an osmoregulator. It's controlling the solute, and in this case the solute is salt. It's controlling the salt concentration and water concentration inside of its body. So it has different mechanisms to control the salt and water concentration. Urine volume, relatively small, minimal, and what it does excrete tends to be very salty, so it releases salt that way. It can pass salt out through its gut, just poop it out basically. Some of the salt can be excreted by its gills. Different glands and different structures can actually get salt out of the marine organism's body and excrete it, so it doesn't go into these extreme concentration differences of salt inside the body versus the environment that it's in. It's going to lose water, Water loss is through osmosis, through the gills and the skin, so it has to constantly regulate and try to balance that out. As water's going out, salt can go out, trying to maintain that salt balance. So it's an incredibly difficult process, but life in the ocean has evolved over millions and millions of years to be able to do this. So, and we'll talk about the osmosis and osmoregulators more when we get into the marine organisms, especially when we start talking about some of the sharks. They're amazing with their ability to osmoregulate salt concentrations. So, all right, now temperature is another major issue when you're living in the ocean. How do you regulate your temperature? How do you manage the temperature of your body? Because temperature will directly influence metabolic rates. So generally, we group organisms in two broad categories based on how they control body temperature. Category 1 is what we call the ectotherms. These are organisms in which the environment influences body temperature. Okay, so cold-blooded is the generic term for them. Endotherms are the exact opposite. They have an internal body temperature that they control and they regulate. We often say those are warm-blooded organisms. So they're controlling their body temperature is influenced differently. Ecto, external environment influences your temperature. Endo, internal body environment influences your temperature. So our examples, turtles, ectotherms, dolphins, endotherms. We will also group them into other categories called poikilothers and homeotherms. Now, a poikilotherm is an organism in which the body temperature varies with the temperature of the surrounding environment. So as the environment gets warmer, the body temperature goes up. As the environment cools down, body temperature cools down. Most of your your ectotherms are going to be poikilotherms as well, because the external environment influences their body temperature. Homeotherms, these are organisms that regulate their body temperature so it doesn't vary as much as the temperature of the surrounding environment. So internal homeostasis, trying to create that temperature balance internally. You're regulating it, you're pushing it up or bringing it back down, so that way the environment, the surrounding environment, doesn't influence it and doesn't create problems. So if you can't regulate your temperature, you're going to be in a world of hurt in the marine environment. And that's something all of us will experience as we spend time in the water. Our body temperature is going to go down. We need to be able to regulate it and bring it back up and maintain that 98.6 approximately temperature range for us to all be healthy and safe during our time in the ocean. All right, now surface to volume ratio is another factor we want to consider when we're looking at living in the ocean. Smaller organisms, the smaller the cell, the smaller the organism, the greater the surface to volume ratio. So if you have this big giant cell, you have actually a smaller surface area to volume ratio. Now, where this is important is how you obtain nutrients, how you obtain water diffusion, or osmosis of water and diffusion of different things in and out of your cells. If you're small, you can use diffusion for the exchange of materials. If you're bigger, diffusion is no longer efficient and you have to have an alternative strategy or mechanism in which you exchange materials with the environment. Whether that's waste product, whether that's food, whether that's nutrients, surface to volume ratio makes a difference. All right, now we also want to take a brief look at reproductive options and opportunities and methods. We'll explore this more as we get into different groups, but just the highlights. Some things reproduce asexually. They don't need a partner. They're by themselves. Fission. You simply split yourself in half. Now you got two. Budding. Let's make a small little clone of ourselves off of one part. And that breaks off, and now there's another one of me out there. Vegetative reproduction. This is primarily found in the plants, in which they send a new underground stem called a rhizome that shoots out, and then pow, here comes a new plant growing up from it. So our turtle grasses will do that. Okay, so we tend to see fission and budding more prevalent in a lot of the single-celled organisms in the ocean. We will see that fission and budding can happen, well, budding in particular, can happen in the corals. That's a main reproductive method in a lot of corals. You can split them, they can bud, and now they're reproducing asexually. Things can reproduce sexually in the ocean, in the marine environment. The parents make gametes, eggs or sperm, and then those come together, you now have a genetically unique individual. A major thing to stress here, I would put a big red star next to this in your notes or highlight it. In times of stress, if you can go back and forth between sexual and asexual, in times of stress, sexual reproduction is favored because it gives you genetic diversity. In good environments, asexual is fine. You reproduce lots and lots and lots of clones that are identical to you. But stressful environments, bad environmental conditions, things shift over and go sexual, if they can go back and forth. Now, in sexual reproduction, a lot of marine organisms are what we call broadcast spawners, or they do broadcast spawning. They don't fertilize internally. They simply, broadcast spawning is release your sperm and eggs into the water and hope they meet up. Corals. If you're snorkeling or diving during certain periods of the year, the lunar cycle dictates all this, you watch corals spawn, all these eggs get released, all these sperm get released, and it looks like a milky cloud in the water. That's their method of fertilization. Groupers do this. Groupers will aggregate at certain times of the year, and you'll have hundreds and thousands of them all swimming together in this big, massive school, and they're all releasing sperm and eggs into the water, hoping for fertilization. So that's what we call broadcast spawning. So it's a numbers game. If you're going to reproduce that way, you need to put out a lot of sperm and a lot of eggs. Internal fertilization, this is seen in a lot of the sharks. Now, broadcast spawning is in most of the other fish, but when we get into the sharks, we're going to see internal fertilization for a lot of them. The male has a copulatory organ that actually inserts sperm directly into the female's reproductive tract. So the sharks here look like bamboo sharks. The male bites and grabs hold of the female, sometimes the fin, one of the pectoral fins, or the side of her head or back area, and then he rolls over, inserts his copulatory organ into her cloaca, and the sperm go down this little groove into the cloaca, and hopefully fertilization occurs. So when you find sharks that have bite marks in them, quite often that was from mating, not fighting. And the third or last thing to mention on the modes of reproduction, quite a few organisms in the marine world are hermaphrodites, meaning the organism produces both male and female reproductive structures. So they can then produce both sperm and eggs. So this little goofy thing on the left is a lettuce sea slug. A lot of the different sea slugs are hermaphroditic. They will release sperm and they produce eggs, so then they can pass on sperm and receive sperm from a different individual. So it's doubling your genetic potential if you're a hermaphrodite. And sea slugs do this crazy reproductive thing we'll talk about when we get into sea slugs. And a lot of the corals. Corals are hermaphroditic. They release eggs at one time, and then several days later, some of them, they will then shift over and release the sperm. Earlier, some were releasing sperm, and then they shift over and they release eggs. So the goal, if you're a hermaphrodite, is not to self-fertilize. It's to give sperm and also receive it from somebody else, so then you fertilize your eggs. So it tries to double your reproductive potential. All right, so the basics of biology, trying to apply some of those core fundamentals to the marine environment.